talking to a Chinese linguist, and we were discussing topics of identity and language and dialect. And he said, among the linguists, there's a joke about what's the difference between a language and a dialect. He said, language has an army. So it kind of reminded me a lot of what was being discussed here. This topic today is something that I just basically came up with. It's been an observation that my Chinese colleagues and I have been making and been observing for the last 15 years. And over this last project, this last trip to China, really kind of hit home. And it's something that I've been kind of watching and observing, and this conference gave me an opportunity to kind of put it together into one context and into one presentation. So I'm really looking forward to hearing some of your comments. What does Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and Mumbai, India have that China does not? Massive permanent slums on the outside of the cities. China is one of the few countries, developing countries in the world, where you do not see those giant type of favelas and those huge type of massive slums. It doesn't mean they don't exist, but we don't see them in the way that we see in other countries. So for example, Mumbai, India. If we take a look, you can see Mumbai, India, you can see kind of swaths of these kind of differences between the inner city and these suburbs. And we take a closer look, and you can get an idea of these larger, massive type of slums. And even on the inside, you can really see the type of life. Same thing in Rio. You take a good look and you can see the real kind of clear distinctions, large kind of distinctions of areas. And I guess everybody's familiar with the term favelas. And looking at down and getting inside and looking at the favelas. So you see these really big type of slums that you really don't see in China. So there's complex and political reasons, real complex social and political reasons and historical reasons why these occur. However, land rights and the pace of urbanization play a role. Also, how you have registration, rural and urban classifications play a role in these type of developments. So what we tend to see in these most developing countries is that we have rural landless villagers where you have property rights that are clear enough that people can sell, they end up selling their land. They sell their land and they go to the urban areas for work. If they can't find work or they end up in the slum areas, they can't go back to the rural areas because they've already sold their land. They've already had this, I mean, there's really no opportunity to go back. So then, and there's also enough mobility and freedom there where they can live in these cities as far as legally goes. So these are the two type of distinctions I'm looking at. But in China, you know, here you see the property rights and massive suburban slums. Selling your land, not being able to go back. But China has a very different case. You have no clear property rights, and you have very clear distinction between rural and urban. That is also legal distinction through classification, a household classification system, or household registration system. So today I have one story and two villagers. So the main story here has to do with the household registration system. This is kind of a Cold War mouse legacy that still exists today in land rights. So I'll give a quick overview. This is something I talk about within a week in my class, but I'm going to give you a 1 minute overview. In China, starting in the late 1950s, all the way up into the 1980s, they had a rural and urban classification system based on your birth, where you're born, geography, and occupation. If you're born in the countryside and you have what they call an agricultural registration card, you cannot move to the city. And in the cities, you were born in the city, you have an urban registration card because the government controlled all the factories, all the stores, everywhere you worked. There were no private stores, private factories, the factory, you worked in the factory in the urban area, the factory provided your housing, your food coupons. The stores were state-owned. So if you didn't have an urban registration card, you couldn't get a job in the cities. So throughout the 1960s, 70s, and much of the 80s, rural and urban migration was almost non-existent, very limited. And it wasn't until about the 1990s, late 1980s, mid to late 1980s and the 1990s, that the Chinese government kind of loosened up these restrictions. Much of it had to do with market reforms. Now you had private stores, you had areas where you can buy some apartments, you also had factories that were semi-private, and there was an opportunity to work. And the government could not expand the cities without labor from the countryside. The massive buildings we see in Beijing, Shanghai, and all the cities, these were built by rural labor, migrant labor. So the government loosened up these restrictions to allow rural migration. rural to urban migration. However, those restrictions still exist. They've loosened up, but the household registration system is still in existence. Many of the cases where they're trying to loosen it up, where families could move to the cities and their kids couldn't go to school. They would send their kids back to the villages. Now, there's new laws that are allowing them to go to school, and there are migrant schools. So we're starting to see this loosen up. But we do see that one of the key factors here is that the household registration system really kept the classification distinction between the two. And this also gets at some of the idea of what we talked about identity too. Who are you? Are you part of the city? Or are you part of the countryside? And one of the key points here is that also contributes to temporary migration, not fully moving to the cities. Second is land rights. Nobody owns land in China. Nobody owns land in China. It is what they call land use rights. So villagers who leave their village don't sell their land. They're actually they lease it from the local government, and they actually sublease it to other farmers. So villagers, when they go to the cities to work, rural migrants, they haven't lost their land. They haven't lost their rural home. So that's an important part. So the spread of urbanization is we see this enveloping of villages in urban areas that expand. So as the city kind of moves off, we see that in China, it's not just expanding up, but out. What used to be a county becomes a district. And then the land rights start to change. And then the urban district starts to develop more. And what they do is they buy land from villagers, and if you have a large village, and then they have with a lot of land, then the urban city buys the land use rights from the villagers. Then the villagers have no more farmland. Then they consolidate the villagers into one area where about 7 or 5 villages now become one little urban district. Then the city develops around them. The result, urban villages. So, the two types of villagers I'm talking about today. First is the original villagers. The villagers who were living in the village originally and then become part of this urban village. And then there are the villagers who are migrant workers who live in urban villages. Why would migrant workers be a part of this? It's because of the household registration system, it's easier for them to rent places and to live in these urban villages, as opposed to the other apartment complexes that are more expensive and harder to register. So for example, I wanted to look at what it was like to live in an urban village, and I wanted to rent one of these boarding homes. And they said, oh, you have to register. And even as a foreigner, I gave a little bit extra, and I was able to rent the place. So even with my white face, I was able to get away with it. So if you have migrant workers, it's the same type of concept. So the example I'm using today is Xi'an, which is in central China. And I'm using pictures from Google Earth, of course. And as we come down, this is, if you can see the difference here, this is different than we were looking at the Mumbai and the Rio case, because here we can identify one smaller patch, not large swaths of these type of slum areas. So this is looking at one example. So here is one example of what we call an urban village. And this is the inside of it. So this is the urban village. Actually, many of them do have a front gate with the name of it and different gates where you can come into. This is the inside of the urban village. And you can see here, if it wasn't for the Chinese signs, it would probably look much like what we've seen in Mumbai and in Rio, except for the Rio part lacking the crime. I had some Latin American people from Costa Rica came to visit, and I took them through some of the urban villages. And they said, I don't want to take my purse with me. I'm really worried. They were very scared. I said, no, it's very different. You don't have to worry about that too much. But here, this is kind of gives you a general sentiment. And many of these areas you see are very similar to this. And again, this is typical. And what you see here is public shower. This is a boarding house. This is a kind of a healthcare center, restaurants. So very narrow streets, and you can tell by the buildings here, they don't go more than 3 to 4 stories. This particular village, 1992, the village committee sells the land use rights to the city. The city gives them money for the land that they've taken. Then they consolidate all the villagers into these buildings that you see here. And so now, what was considered a large swath of land could have been up to about 20, 30 acres are now kind of brought back into a very tiny condensed space. And the villagers now have these areas, and they're almost like row houses. And so they're pretty large. And the villagers also turn those into boarding homes or restaurants and give them opportunities, market opportunities. In this particular place, they have about 13,000 original villagers, and they have about 15,000 migrants. Now, I talked to the local police, and they were very nice, especially after a few drinks. They're very open and discussing. And they were telling me that they don't really know how many migrant workers live, and that they're supposed to officially register. Some do, most do not. That's why they're there. But the police kind of know this and kind of understand this. And as long as they keep the peace, there's this kind of understanding that it's okay in that general sense. So here is, we have migrant workers. Okay, so the Chinese stuff doesn't show up. This presentation was given in China first because I wanted to run it by my Chinese colleagues and then let them drill me, and then I can do it in the US. So migrant workers, migrant outside workers, and boarding houses. So here is actually a farmer's home. You can see this is a regular house. And on the inside, this is the registration room, and then this is where the boarding house is. The key point here is that migrant workers are temporary urban residents, anywhere from 8 months to 8 years. And they typically all go back during the Chinese New Year's. You go into any urban village in the end of January, and it's almost empty. Right? Or at least half the people are gone, because they go back to the New Year's. They can go back, they have homes, they have land. So again, that's one of the key points, the differences here. Another thing is identity. I've seen some Americans kind of look at this and they say, oh, these rural migrants, it's us and them, the original villagers, and then the migrant workers have their own identity, which is not really the case. The migrant workers' kind of identity and who they are, it's more atomized, because you'll have groups from one area, one county, or one part, one from Hunan province, or one here. So the migrant workers in the villages, in these urban villages, it's not really migrant workers versus the original villagers. Even within the migrant workers, there's not one complete sense of community. It's kind of atomized, in a sense, because they're not all there at the same time. They come and go, and there's a native place. It plays a huge role there. So this is for my Chinese friends, this was a riot. Everybody broke out laughing with this. Obviously not here. Okay. This is a really famous Chinese cartoon character, Xi Yang Yang. And this is it would be like having I guess the Charlie Brown boarding house, or some sort of famous cartoon character boarding house. This is the harmonious boarding house, to Chinese harmonious society, and they're doing this. And this is a public toilet. So, but you have, there's a lot of public toilets, a lot of internet bars, and a lot of public showers. This is one migrant worker. He's been here for 8 years. Mr. Hu was kind of a kid, because he was asking why I was taking pictures, and we were talking a little bit. And his sons came, and then they went back to the village. He goes back every year. So he's an example of somebody who's been here for a long time. And when you ask him, where's your home? He says, it's Hunan, not here. You ask him, where do you live? What is your place? He says, no, I'm here, but this isn't my home. And he's been here for over 8 years. So again, it kind of gets in that sense of identity when you talk about temporary versus permanent areas. Urban services here. You have a lot of these clinics. You have community center, public toilets. You also have public showers. When I wanted to go to the boarding house and I wanted to see what the boarding houses look like, and I did this in several urban villages, I would go in and I would say I want to rent a room, and they'd say, okay, well the room's 40 kwai. I said 40 kwai, which is maybe about $8 or so, and I said, great. He said, do you want a bathroom with that? I said, yeah, well it's going to be 50. And a shower is going to be outside down the hall, or outside the next building. And you have cobblers. You used to see these a lot in most urban cities, but now people are able to buy new shoes a little bit more. But in these urban areas and these urban villages, people are repairing older shoes, trying to make good with what they have. The quality of life, by the way, in these urban villages is also just stark, because within the urban village, you can see the 30-story buildings all the way around you. So you've got these on the fronts of some of these urban villages. You have Gucci stores, you can have these incredibly new malls, and in the back you have this. And in the quality of life here is again, with public showers, flush toilets. I mean, you have a lot of the rural life still there. One key point too is water source. So when I talk to the local government officials in these different places, they tell me that they get groundwater. Groundwater in the urban areas is pretty dangerous and pretty contaminated, while the rest of the city gets their water from the local river. So again, the quality of life distinctions here are pretty stark. The police, and again, the police have a very real presence in these areas. Talking to the original villagers, and they would tell me about their stories. So I learned a lot about what was happening from here. And you also have two childhood friends. They were a kick, so they kind of filled up a lot of what was happening. And they were kind of born and raised in the village together. And now they said we were village girls, and now we're going to be urban residents together, which they aren't yet. These are villagers' homes. Two people that really typified what was going on here. Mr. John is 68 years old, retired, he's a farmer, and then retired postal worker. That shouldn't say retired farmers. Farmers don't retire. In China, they work till they drop. But 1992, his family received 24,000 Chinese yuan, which is about almost $3,000 US per mu. One mu is 1.6 acres. His family had two mu of land, and they grew wheat. He said he's happy to be an urban citizen now, but he will be soon. He isn't yet. He said, but without land and no insurance, there's always something in the back of your head that there's a fear. You know, land is your insurance. Grain is your insurance. And there's a little bit worried about that. The city told him that they're going to move, but he doesn't know when. His leader, the leader of this village, told me when they're going to move. They're going to move 2 years from now. And they're going to give them, they're building a large apartment complex. Why? Because the land now is worth so much more for developers in the interior, in the city now, after 20 years of development. So they want to move them out, but they have to negotiate with the villagers on this. And then they move them into a 30-story apartment complex. This woman was even better. She was a village committee member before, and she was great. And she told me the exact same story, exact same idea, but she said the village committee sold the land for 100,000 yen per mu and gave the villagers 24,000 each. She said part of that money isn't just corruption. She said that helped build some of the infrastructure within the new village community, but she said a lot of that was pocketed by the village community members. And she said, and I said, how do you know that? She says, well, some of it went in my pocket. You know, you can pretty trust somebody who's going to tell me that. She doesn't want to be an urban person. She says, I don't want to be a city dweller. I miss having the land. I'm still worried about the future. And without that land, you don't have the future. Then, before 1992, she was a rural registration. The key point here, especially about this conference and identity, after 1992, they got a transfer agricultural registration card. You're not rural and you're not urban. It's this limbo registration that they are in for almost 20 years. And it's not going to be until after 2013 that they're going to get their official urban registration and then move into a high-rise. And then this urban village will be raised. So the urbanization process, at least in some of the Chinese context, is agricultural registration and rural contract land. From there, you go to the urban government will expand. And this expansion is going on now, more so now than it ever has in the past. And this is why my colleague and I think this is a really interesting research topic. We think there's another 10 years, to really try to get a sense of this. Then from this movement, you have villagers lose their farmland and their homes are consolidated. Then they're in this kind of registration limbo where villagers have transitional registration and migrant workers live in the village at the same time. And this process can be anywhere from 10 to 20 to almost 30 years, depending on how the village works and how they negotiate with the city and how city land prices develop. An urban government negotiates the rest of the village land and the villagers become urban residents. And the migrant workers move to another urban village or they go back. And so that's an interesting case. So here, this is using this study. I've given you a case here, but we've been looking at lots of cases. This is the number of villages in Shanxi province from 1990 to 2008. You can see here a real precipitous drop in the number of villages. And that really reflects the urbanization process in small and large cities in this province as villages start to be consolidated and kind of ended, literally. So here is kind of the case we see in China, we see that the suburbs are actually moving out and into these rural areas. And as they move out to the rural areas, these villages become urban villages, and this is that space. And then as this urban village consolidates, the building and everything comes up from around it, like we saw in the Google Earth. And so the other case, that was the one village. The rural villagers, what we see in China, they can come to the cities, but they're also able to go back. They still have land, they still have their insurance. And they're really unwilling, in many cases, to give up that land. And that's kind of one of the explanations, kind of institutional explanations we see, why China doesn't have those massive slums that we see in other countries, in developing countries, at least at this case. I have a tremendous amount of discussions and arguments with economists who say property rights are key. They need to be able to buy and sell private property. I said, that's the worst thing that can happen in China today. I think China's avoided a lot of some of the problems we've seen in developing countries so far, based on some of these institutions. So China's urbanization is closely associated with this household registration system and land rights. And I think that's going to be the two things that, if anybody has an interest in looking at this over time, might pay attention to. And the lack of property rights contributes to a lack of massive slums so far. And that's kind of the urbanization process. And I think that's about my time. Okay, and one last thing here is the Chinese government. This is a website on urban villages for Xi'an. So the government is very much aware of these urban villages, and it's not haphazard. So there is a plan, there is things going along with it. And I guess one other thing here is, these are the new apartment complex that comes in. So this is an old urban village, and that's how they're building the new ones. And this is where some of the villagers won't go into these, they'll go into different ones. And this is a new project that the Chinese government is putting together. This is Xi'an City. This is the new urban project from 2010 to 2020. So our next project is to try to look at this process from the beginning and watch how it pans out in this area. So this is just one example of what China's going through now. The goal for the Chinese government is, if we're more urban and less rural, we're more developed. But how does that urbanization process influence the lives and the quality of lives of the villagers? And how is that process going to proceed in the long run? Is something that we're looking at. Thank you.